well, I'd like to start with what I think are some of the positives in the document and then go on to the negatives. On the issue of Trident, I'll come back to the NATO question, but on the issue of Trident, I think the document is as good as we could expect, in that first it says the issue of Trident will be part of the transitional negotiations. It won't be left until after the first set of elections, so it'll be part of those transitional negotiations. Secondly, it says that it should, that there should be the insistence that Trident is removed as soon as this can safely be done, and it refers specifically to Scottish CND's detailed report on disarming Trident. There's a reference there, and the procedures and the time scale, etc. And it does say again that this should be done within the first term. In other words, it should have been completed, the removal, by the first term. It also says, you know, as you say, that they would favour in a future constitution that there should be a constitutional ban on nuclear weapons in Scottish territory. So these are all significant pluses. Some of the other pluses, or rather I would say it's more like middling gains, which could have been much better and could be much better, and I think we should push on this, is the suggested budget that should be spent for defence. Now, the current expenditure, Scotland's share is 3.3 billion, and they're suggesting a defence budget of 2.5 billion a year. Now, this does give us a defence bonus. So there is a gain there, and in fact, it has been linked to providing the funding, the initial funding, for the childcare proposals. So that is a bit of a plus that we can push, but it is in fact a high figure. If you look at 3 other studies that have been done by people who are certainly not peace movement in background, then you have Stuart Crawford, who one would certainly not consider a radical on these issues, and he said that the maximum budget that he thought a Scottish government should go to would be about 1.8 billion a year, possibly less. Philip O'Brien, Glasgow University, came out with something similar, looking at other countries, comparable countries, of about 1.7 billion a year, and Dorcha Lee, the former Irish Army colonel who's done some work on this, was a bit lower and said it should be about 1.4 billion a year. So in other words, they have come out with what is a pretty high figure. It's still a bonus, but we should be arguing for a much bigger bonus. One of the things that the document doesn't do is to attempt to do an assessment of what are the security risks for Scotland. Now, they do say that in the first Parliament there will be commissioned a proper security assessment of the situation. But having said that, it then goes on to make projections as to defence capabilities for 10 years ahead. And it starts off by saying that Scottish Defence Forces should be at the level of 7,500 full-time and about 2,000, I think, reserves. But it then says that after 10 years it should be up to 15,000 full-time and 5,000 reserves. So you have to say, are you envisaging that the risk to Scotland, the security situation, is going to be worse? You know, why this kind of increase? When if you look outside of Asia, maybe parts of Africa, but most parts of the world are reducing their troop numbers are reducing their defence budgets. And much of this is done for economic reasons, but also because of what they see as the kind of threats. And if you look even at the UK's last security review, it was putting things like cyber attacks and terrorism, you know, up there in first-tier risks. But these are essentially policing issues, and they're expert technology issues. So they're, I think, for political reasons, essentially for political reasons. They are trying to suggest that all the current sites will be fine and employment will be okay. So it's a bit of a political exercise in that sense. Now, to start with, there was a comment early on in the section on this which said, for decades we have been part of a Westminster system that has sought to project global power, giving Britain the capacity to engage in overseas military interventions and to deploy nuclear weapons. So I thought, oh good. So you're going to start to think in terms of, well, it's not our job per se to police the world or to project our power. And therefore to start to think about defence policy in an independent Scotland in that kind of context. But then, you know, by the end it goes on to talk about, yes, and we should end up after 10 years having 16 fast jets at Lossiemouth. I think a wee bit of constituency interests here.
Sure.
In order to fulfil our obligations to NATO. You know, so you get these things coming in, and which are not essentially about Scotland's position per se. It is about the NATO commitment that, you know, runs through this. So these are things that should be challenged, but they're quite far down in the future, you know, in certain respects, but certainly can be challenged. And there are things. I mean. Yes, there is also a commitment that Scottish forces may help UN peacekeeping exercises. Ireland, I believe, has a maximum number of, I think it's about 950 troops at any one time who can be available in the field in peacekeeping exercises. And, you know, Ireland's defence budget is tiny. You know, this is the kind of thing we should be looking at. One thing which wasn't quite spelt out clearly enough, and I think it's important for us to spell out, and that again comes back to the jobs issue, and I'll just finish on this, because 2 points here. In relation to Faslane, it just uses the figure of 6,500 military and civilian employment there. It doesn't distinguish, which I think it ought to have, because there's only 2,500 civilian employees in at Faslane, and of these 2,500, the MOD's own figures are that only 520 are directly related to Trident. Most of the work in Faslane relates to the other, the astute submarines, well, which are planned to increase there. Now, I've always thought it was really quite reasonable. We ensure we get rid of Trident early. There's an absolute red line, but yes, the rest of the UK military, the MOD, will be desperate to hold on to Faslane for their other submarine work, because there is nowhere they can go with Trident, but they can eventually have other locations for the rest of their submarine work, but it will take time. And the document is suggesting a transitional, or appears to be suggesting a transitional 10-year period. But that's where more of the civilian work is there. They're also proposing that Faslane is the headquarters of for all the forces, both naval and other forces in Scotland. So that is very much to address the employment thing. There is confusion in what is said there when it comes to the defence industries, because quite a bit is said on shipbuilding and on orders that might be placed. But there are times when it says we really want to be promoting and developing defence industries in Scotland, and you have to say, do we? You know, can we have clarification here? Do we want to make arms sales one of the big characteristics of Scotland, as it is of the UK, which is what, fourth largest arms seller in the world? So lack of clarification there, and I think there is a reference to diversification, but that needs to be upfront to a much greater extent. We need to put serious efforts into a diversification unit and much more focus in that work. So it's a mixed bag. I think there are things we can take. We can take the Trident stuff from it, use it positively. We can take the defence bonus there, use it positively. Some of the rest, we really have to say, well, that's your opinion, but what's going to happen 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Maybe Scotland, we hope, will be going in a rather different direction rather than increasing its armed forces.